would like to improve education here at the university. Okay, so Louis, welcome very much. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Yes. So it's pretty exciting. Isaac, we've been talking for several months, telling me about this this initiative here, if I may use that word, on how to improve teaching and learning, and that's pretty exciting. And I'll be following that very closely. So, yeah, so first, let's talk about what active learning is. We've all heard that word. And surprisingly, let's talk about what a traditional lecture is, because I think people are getting these things muddled a little bit. So it's important to have those two things clear in our minds, especially when you're anywhere else in the world other than North America, where things in terms of active learning are far more advanced, right? So, yeah, so in North America, it's now become widespread, okay? But the intensity does vary. But if you show up to any STEM department in any university in North America, it is not possible to not have active learning. Whereas 15, 20 years ago, absolutely. It would have been possible to go into a department and see that there really isn't much of it. Now it's everywhere. However, there's a beautiful, there's a very nice large-scale survey that was published in Science Magazine a few years back that looked at the type of active learning or the amount of active learning used across North American universities. And what they found is that, yeah, 50% of classes has some amount of active learning in them. That's a lot, right? But they also found that only 10-15% of them could be deemed fully student-centered. And I don't remember exactly what the number was to qualify as student-centered, but fully student-centered. But it was something like 3/4 or 2/3 of the time during lecture that's devoted to active learning. Okay, so only 10 to 15% have that. So there's still room to grow. So if you were to walk into any classroom in North America, Canada's the same as the United States in terms of implementing those new teaching techniques. If you were to walk in, what are you most likely to see in terms of active learning is something like this. Okay, you're most likely to see on a screen like this what we like to refer to as a clicker question. Can you raise your hand if you have used a clicker question before in your course? I don't expect many hands. Can you raise your hand if you have never heard the word clicker before? Okay, that's fine. Let me explain. So, so clickers, basically, the way this is used, that in an otherwise traditional lecture, okay, is that now all of a sudden you punctuate the lecture with those clickers. So every 20 minutes or so, you stop your lecture and then you show a conceptual question on the screen, just to make sure that students are following, right? So that students can assess their own understanding. And you as the instructor can assess how the class is doing, okay? So after 20 minutes, maybe you have 2 clicker questions like this, and students have to commit to an answer. And nowadays, with all the apps, what they do is they go on their phones and they say B, right? And this is important psychologically because what you find is when students commit to an answer, they're much more likely to be engaged once you provide the feedback, right? You tell them, hey, everyone, the correct answer here was C. And here's why it's C. Let me show you how an expert thinks about that. This is wonderful. When you do this, something as simple as this in your course, it transforms everything. It really does. In fact, when instructors start using this, I always warn them with the following. I say, be careful. Now that you're going to start using clickers, you're going to have a harder time to manage your class. And the aspect of the class that's going to be harder to manage are the student questions. Because all of a sudden, when students are more engaged because of things like that, they start asking more questions. Okay, so that's a good thing, but that becomes harder to manage. So, but clickers is just one kind of active learning. But how many different kinds of ways you can engage students in the classroom? I don't know, there's infinite number of ways, right? But, if you care about, a conceptual change, right? In your discipline, you say, students' conception of this thing here really needs to change. Then in this case, clicker questions are actually very nice. And peer instruction, which was developed by one of my colleagues actually at the university, Eric Mazur, peer instruction is just a very specific way to do clickers, okay? But clickers are really good for that. Problem-solving skills, which we often really care about. This is often what we view as the most difficult thing for students to get good at. In-class worksheets, which I'll discuss in more detail in a few minutes. That's good for that. Now, in engineering, for example, people care a whole lot about collaborative and teamwork, right? So in this case, then you might want to have some elements of project-based learning or team-based learning. So one of the reasons I show you different kinds of active learning here is that I like to remind people that the amount of training required to do one active learning over the other can change greatly, okay? And you just have to keep track of which goal you're after, okay, to know that you're using the right active learning. For example, project-based learning here is really difficult to implement properly. It takes over a year of training to do that well. Whereas clickers, you can do this with pretty much no training, okay? And the worksheet, I'll talk more about this, but I want to encourage you to do that in your class as well, though with some warnings. And of course, many more. So I'll talk about a very specific kind of in-class worksheets that we published in Science like several years ago, and that's become fairly widespread in North America now. And what you're gonna like about this type of in-class worksheet is that it's high-density learning, and it's the only type of active learning that I know where you can cover as much in lecture as you would if you were to lecture traditionally, sorry. So that's pretty good. People care about that. Okay. Now I have to promise myself not to spend too long on this slide because that's something I care about so much. So deliberate practice. Can you raise your hand if you have heard of these words? Deliberate practice. I don't expect many of you have. Okay. So again, everything we do can always be mapped back onto these things. So that's why I care a great deal about this. These are like the fundamental principles of what we do, okay, of the discipline. So essentially, what is deliberate practice? Well, it's a framework basically of the type of things that you need to do to achieve expertise in anything, in sports, music, in STEM disciplines. It's all the same principles. In fact, in retrospect, it's not surprising, but it was surprising 40 years ago when cognitive psychologists started to study, masters in their own disciplines, like pianists that became masters, tennis players in sports that became masters, mathematicians or whatever, and they asked themselves the question, are there commonalities in their training in how they became masters? And at the time, maybe it was a little bit shocking, but again, in retrospect, it wasn't, and I'll convince you of that the commonality is striking. They all did the same steps. It all contains the same elements. So long story short, deliberate practice is this, in a nutshell, is imagine a coach or a tutor, a coach in sports or a tutor with in STEM disciplines, okay? And the tutor sees a very complex task for the student to learn, right? So the tutor is so experienced that the tutor knows how to decompose that complex task into sub-tasks, right? Sub-skills. And then the experienced tutor knows how to give and when to give targeted feedback to the learner while they practice that sub-skill. Then they know when the sub-skill has been mastered. Then you move on to the next sub-skill. They know which next sub-skill to practice. Then they know how to integrate the sub-skills until the full complex task has been mastered, right? That's deliberate practice in a nutshell. And when I explain it this way, I'm sure you tell yourself, that's pretty common sense, right? That makes sense. So one of the founders of the discipline, I had the chance to talk to him. He's at UCLA. His name is Robert Bjork. And in the 70s, he was asked by the American Olympic diving team to try to implement deliberate practice for them, at least show them how to do that. And he's the one that was telling me, Louis, because at the time I didn't know anything about that stuff, was saying, Louis, what do you think is the percentage of the practice, of the training, that's with the target or the complex skill? Like, for example, a quadruple somersault, divers, right? It's a quadruple somersault. That's the target, right? So he would ask me, and I remember where I was, because that was a really memorable moment for me. He said, how much of the time do you think that the gold-winning Olympic athlete, spent on practicing the actual target? 30%, something like that, 40%. And he was like, significantly less than 5% of the time. And that was new for people before they use a deliberate practice. So if you really do well at practicing the sub skills and you reorganize your mental model, you become very robust in terms of being able to do the complex task properly. Okay, like I said, I cannot get carried away too much. So what I just told you is sort of the structure, okay, of how deliberate practice works, but it doesn't tell you anything about when you're, like a basketball free throw, or let's do the quadruple somersault. It doesn't tell you anything about, well, when you're practicing this part of the jump here, how does that function? What are you supposed to do? Or when you're practicing once you left the board, how does that function? Are there elements there that you need to target? The answer is yes. So that's sort of the functional framework, if you will. There are 4 elements, that's it. And I would advise you to commit them to memory, because everything we do should be mapped onto these 4 elements here. Everything, no exception. So first, it's adaptive task selection. So a good tutor or an expert coach or an expert tutor, first, of course, will make sure to adjust the task to the learner, right? And then we'll make sure that this actual task that was designed is just perfectly designed to achieve the goal, okay, to go in the right direction. Then once the student is practicing the task, then the student needs to receive feedback in the form of the expert tutor will help, the student identify and explain errors, right? Hey, that's wrong, and here's why. Or, hey, this is right, and here's why. And then reinforce the correct elements. Now, the third one that I care a lot about, and we did a really cool study on this that I'll show you in about 15 minutes, is explicit error engagement. And this one is like the forgotten child of these 4 elements here. It's often forgotten, but it's not in sports, though. Trust me, they don't forget that in sport. But all 4 elements are equally important. So what is this one? Well, once you've gotten the feedback that, hey, what you're doing is wrong, it's incorrect, right? It turns out that it's not enough to tell the learner, hey, let me show you how to do it correctly. This is how you do it correctly. Now go ahead, right? Try it. It's not enough. What you have to do is the student's mind or the athlete's mind has to make a decision. The mind itself has to make a decision that the incorrect thinking was in fact incorrect. You have to be faced with the incorrect thinking to rewire the brain to say, no, that is not correct. I need to do that instead. And that actually is backed up by, even neuroscience. So this is very, very important. You make the student work the mistake until the knowledge is reorganized. And the fourth one, let's just say motivation. Is motivation important? Heck yeah. So, but not just motivation. The expert coach here will always make sure to manage the student or the athlete's frustration and encourage persistence. Okay? So, do you get a feeling now that if you address all 4 elements here, you can do pretty well? Do you also get a feeling that if you forget any one of those 4, you are going to do very poorly? Pick any one. Like if you don't address motivation, we all know that everything else almost does not matter, right? If your students are not motivated. Any questions? You should feel free to ask me any questions you want. Okay, so as promised, there are many kinds of active learning, and I said I was going to give you a feel for in-class worksheets. Do you remember we talked about clickers? Now let's talk about something a bit more involved. And this is what we do, and what's now fairly widespread. It's pretty simple. At least the concept of it is simple. So when you have an hour and a half lecture, biology, chemistry, whatever, you typically cover between 4 to 7 learning goals, 4 to 7 main ideas. Okay, so what you do is you design one in-class activity, like this page here, one activity per learning goal or per big idea. Okay, so that's an example. That one here is activity 1. So that must have been the first big idea of the day. Okay, and what you do is that you spend about 15 minutes or so on average per activity. This varies, but roughly 15 minutes. But what's surprising, may surprise you, is that the first 7 or 8 minutes on that activity, you tell students to get into groups and to work on that activity themselves. And then they work, they get as far as they can. Then you interrupt them, even if they're not finished. And then you say, okay, now it's time for you to hear how an expert, thinks about these things. And our students listen and they get their thinking corrected with the feedback. So again, 7-8 minutes where they do it first without having a lecture. And then you provide what could be termed a lecture right after that, a 7 or 8 minute lecture where students appear to be playing a passive role. But I want you to think about this. If you walked into a classroom where the instructor is giving the feedback on that activity, wouldn't you agree that if you walk in that classroom, then it would appear that this is a traditional lecture? Because students are kind of just listening and the instructor is talking. And yet, I'll show you, this is one of the most effective kind of active learning that you can do in the STEM courses. So what gives here? So it looks like we should pay attention to more than what students are actually doing and what they're actually thinking, like cognitively what's happening. So the reason here why it's so productive is I always remind people that when students do the activity here, the main objective is to get them prepared, we say prompted, for the mini lecture that's about to come. So they have all the right mental drawers that are open. So they don't get overwhelmed when you start talking, you the instructor, okay? And they can start organizing the information quickly and learn a lot from what you're saying. So that's how it works. The point of those, surprisingly, for them to work on this is not to learn, it's to prepare them for the lecture. Any questions on that? Yes.
Did you check how the groups are doing in this time?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. In fact, you must walk around.
In that,
Oh yeah, that's an actual picture in one of my courses. Yes.
Yeah, can you mention you mentioned in the workshop that you always look for the worst possible scenario for you to implement it. That means you ask always for the biggest possible class in a place where the students they cannot accommodate like this, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that this is very important thing, right? Because sometimes when people think that to apply active learning you need like a special furniture, right? And this is not.
Yeah. Of course, it all helps, right? But a big part of my job is to be able to convince people to do these things and to do the research to show how effective it is, right? So that's why I always make sure that I have the least amount of technology possible. Like clickers, I remember years ago, I would actually have pieces of papers where students would be handed out, blue, green, yellow, whatever, and they answer a question with, you count roughly the number of blues, the number of yellows and everything, just so that people that are afraid of tech would not be afraid of tech, okay? When it comes to a classroom, for people not to use as an excuse, my class is 300 students. I would make sure to do the study in a 300 student class, which is what this is. And I would make sure that it's these types of seats. So the groups cannot be too large, right? And people have to go like that. It's not ideal, but it works great. But does it get better when you get, better seating and all that stuff, those tables? Of course it does. Of course it does, but you don't need to. But yeah, so you were asking me the question, do you have to walk around or you just at the front? You absolutely have to walk around. As the instructor, in fact, you have to listen. You have to pay attention, and students, when they're engaged, they don't even know you're there, right? So you just listen to what they're saying and you're like, okay, it looks like it's productive. And then you keep moving around, you go to the back, because these people tend to disengage first, right? You go to the back, that engages them, just seeing that you're nearby and you listen to what they're doing. And at the same time, when they're struggling a bit too much, so it's no longer productive, then you go back to the front, you stop everyone, and then you guide them through the activity, right? So it's very adaptive. Okay, so here's the evidence for how effective this is. So that's a while back that we published this. It's in 2011, right? But still, it's worth talking about. So here's what we did. So it was an introductory physics course, two very large sections of the same course. Okay, like 300 students, almost 300 students in each section, and we measured every aspect of the student population. You know, there's a lot of surveys that you can give students just to make sure that the student populations were the same. They were the same. They might as well have been clone armies, right? They scored the same on every metric. So, so what we did is that we took one of the best traditional lecturers that we had in the department at the time to lecture the students during 1 week of, you know, on learning goals. And then in the other section, there was someone, me actually, with a grad student, that was implementing this kind of active learning I just told you about for a whole week of the course. Okay, and the goal of this study was to compare how much students learn when there's a traditional instruction versus active learning as I described, but only from that. That is, typically the exposure to the material is confounded with lots of different exposure, like they read the textbook, they go to laboratories, they do their homework. So we made sure during that week to cancel everything else, so that the only exposure to the material was when they're in a seat in the classroom. Okay, and in fact, we surveyed students afterward. We say, did you read the book? If so, it's perfectly fine. If they said yes, we remove them from the study. So truly, the only people that will figure into the results I'll show you are those who were only exposed to information while they were sitting in a seat. Okay, and you'll see that's why the results are so extreme. So yeah, so it was a competition basically. So after that 1 week, they had a mini midterm exam. The midterm exam was to test their understanding of what they learned during that week, either traditionally or this. And I should tell you, the learning goals that were covered were very, very strict. So the same things were covered. And there were people from the department that were very curious, other faculty members that would just come and sit and look at what's happening. So this is the results of the mini exam after that. So you see the white distribution is the people who received the active treatment, doing the worksheets in class. And this is the people that learn traditionally. And these were multiple choice questions. And look, this was guessing. That means the average is not far from guessing, which tells you that this group of 300 or so students learned almost nothing. Okay? Compared to these people at 74%. So this surprised a lot of people, but do you know who it did not surprise at all? It's those staunch traditional lecturers that came to observe both during the competition week. Those ones, they said, oh, okay, I can see it now. Because when you're in a traditional lecture, sitting amongst all those students here, even as an expert, you can tell, I know this material, it's introductory material, and I'm a professor, right? But even I can't follow. After 20 minutes of someone talking, even my mind can't follow. And then you look around and you see how disengaged students are, right? And you realize nothing productive is happening, even though they would say, one in particular I remember, when they're standing at the front and they're doing the lecture, they see all those faces looking at them, some people at the front taking notes, it feels productive. But when they're sitting amongst the crowd, they said clearly nothing good's happening. In contrast, when they would sit into the active learning part, they could hear all the people talking, and they're talking about the physics, and they're engaged and they're arguing about it. So once you see it, it's pretty clear. Now, the thing I always like to remind people is the following. You could argue that these students learn something like roughly twice as much as these students. Sort of. Okay, let's say the number of questions they got right is twice as many questions as these. So one could loosely say that these people here, if throughout their degree, they get this treatment in all courses, and these people throughout their degrees get this treatment in all their courses, you could see that these people would learn twice as much. So when you see something like this here, for anyone to say, I don't care, I don't even want to investigate this active learning stuff, is yeah. So okay, so something that people always love to discuss is a paper that we published in 2019, and it essentially looked at the students' feeling of learning and how this correlates with how much they're actually learning. And it's very interesting. In some cases, it's anti-correlated. That is, the more you feel like you learn, the least you're learning, and vice versa. Okay, and that's something that we need to be mindful of when we implement active learning. Or if you're a really good traditional lecturer, you have to be mindful of that. So essentially, I think it's pretty simple. So one of the most powerful metacognitive cue that we use in our everyday life is perceived fluency. So if someone gives you directions, like for me in Mexico City, I'm new to this, someone gives me directions to a restaurant. If I have the perception that the information that's coming at me is coming very fluently, right? Then I'll interpret that as being very productive. I'll say, I have a strong feeling of learning. And it turns out that 99% of the time in our everyday life, that's accurate. Right? It's accurate. If someone gives you directions and you're like, I'm so confused, this is disfluent in the way the person's talking, you're probably right. That means your feeling of learning, which is low, probably correlates well with how much you've learned, which is very little. Do you see what I mean? But when things become a bit more complex and you don't have immediate feedback, like your student in the class, you're not exactly sure, how do I know if I understood something? And it's complex enough that you can't quite evaluate, then all of a sudden you might fall prey to this very powerful cognitive bias. And I'll show you the results. It's kind of fun. So how do you measure feeling of learning? You literally ask students. It's a feeling. So you ask them in a survey after a learning session, how much do you feel that you've learned? Did you enjoy it? Do you think the feedback was effective? Like these kinds of feeling questions. And why does it matter? Why should we care? Well, do you think feeling of learning might shape, course evaluations? An evaluation of a program, which in North America, your promotion is very strictly, very often tied to these things here. So that really matters, right? It really, really matters. And of course, this feeling of learning will bring some student resistance. Maybe when you start doing active learning and you do it in a way that's effortful, where students have to work hard, you'll see that some are going to resist it and it might impact motivation. So it's very important to address that. So how did we measure it? I don't want to talk about science education research, but there is a point I want to make here through showing you this, is how much control this study had. And that's one of the reasons why it became so popular. This study just took off, by the way. I think it's the most, no, I know it's the most cited paper since 2019 in science education, in all of science education. So yeah, it just took off. So in partly it's because of the amount of control that we had. So here you have the whole class, and we repeated that experiment in 2 different years, by the way. Same results, okay. So we have a whole class, and students are randomly assigned to 2 different sections on a Tuesday, class 1, with topic A, okay, which happens to be a topic in physics. So group A receives the active treatment, group B receives the passive treatment. Here's what's interesting. Do you remember the worksheet? The worksheet that I showed you here? So both groups received the exact same packet. So the thing maybe I should have clarified here is when you come into one of those active learning class, you pick up a packet at the front of the class and you go in your seat. And that packet has all the activities in it. And then during class, you actually write on your packet. Okay? So in the study, both groups, the passive group and the active group, received the exact same packet. And guess what? The feedback that the instructor gave, like this is my handwriting here, by the way. So the feedback that I would have given students here, okay, is the same feedback that the instructor gave in the passive treatment. except that in the passive treatment, the person was able to talk more slowly and to add a bit more details, but the information was the same. Okay, even I remember the words. We try to keep the words as close as possible to what they are in the primary control sheet. So the brains receive the same information. But in this particular case here, students had to work really hard first to be primed for the mini lecture. That's effortful, requires effort. In fact, we surveyed students and they would say, I was really tired at the end of lecture. It required a lot from me, right? Okay. So then after the class, you give them a quick feeling of learning survey. Do you feel like you learned a lot or whatever? And then you give them the mini exam to actually test how much they've learned, okay? And then you repeat the same thing by swapping the conditions. So those who receive the active treatment here with topic A, for topic B, they receive the passive treatment. And here are the results. So this is the result from the exam, and the dark gray here is those who receive the active treatment. Okay, so they scored higher. But here's what's interesting. Everything to the right, these are feeling of learning questions. Look, everything is inverted. You see here, I feel like I learned a great deal from this lecture. They felt like they learned less. And by the way, I always like to tell people, we've all had that experience, I think, when we were undergraduate students, where our instructor was a superstar lecturer, right? Smooth as silk. And we all felt that we learned a lot from that because perceived fluency was very high. So that's what happened here, because this was not just any traditional lecture. We made sure that the fluency was as high as possible. So the traditional instructor practiced a lot. Okay. And then for the second topic, you see the same thing, but now that's the group that had received the traditional treatment. Now they received the active treatment. Same thing. Now they scored higher. And when it came to their feelings were inverted again. And what's interesting is when you actually ask them before the feeling of learning questions, you actually ask them, do you know if you were paying? No. Do you know? Let me read the broken question. I forgot. This lecture mostly involved me as a listener. You say, do you realize that you were mostly just playing a passive role? Yes or no? And students here in the passive treatment, they're telling you, I agree. I was just listening, right? And these people here, they were not listening quite as much. They did some listening. Do you remember? Because at the end of the activity, the instructor gives the feedback, right? So they did some listening, but much less. So they know that they were not engaged. They know that. And even after they said that in the survey, then you ask them how much you feel like you learned, they still feel strongly that they learned more. So it's a very powerful cognitive bias. So what can we do then as instructor? And why should we care? Well, in all your courses, if you're going to introduce active learning, that's effortful, where students have to work hard. You have to intervene early in the semester, and something as simple as a 15-minute intervention during the first week, where you discuss things like, hey, when I happened to be smooth one day because I had a good night of sleep, right? And you feel like I'm clear, then it's normal. You're going to have a feeling of learning, okay? But be careful. Don't always trust this, okay? Because maybe it does not match your actual learning, and vice versa. Sometimes when you're going to work really hard in my course, you're going to be confused. You're going to be constantly in contact with your errors and so forth. It's going to be frustrating. And naturally, you might have a poor feeling of learning. But be careful with that. So you do a 15-minute intervention, and in the paper, our paper, in the supplement, we have the actual intervention there that we use and that was successful, and you can use that in your course. 15 minutes. But throughout the semester, reiterate the value of cognitive effort, right? And this feeling of learning business. You'll see if you survey your students throughout the semester, they'll bring it up to you. They'll say, wow, this was very sort of eye-opening for me when you brought that up. Yes?
Similar feeling. I mean,
Oh.
lecturers resist the fact that they need to keep on going on with active learning because their students are pretty bad.
They resist because,
They don't want to persevere doing the same in-class activity because the students don't like it.
oh, yeah, of course. Of course. Now, by the way, we're going to have to clarify something here because I don't want to send the wrong signal, which would be that students resist active learning and students are absolutely not. In fact, I've, you know, by the time I end one of my course, I don't remember a single student saying, I don't like the active learning. I wish you would have lectured traditionally. That should tell you something. Not one, right? I'm sure there was one, but not that I'm aware of.
The last column of the comparison said, I don't want, I would like my courses to go on like this. It said, I don't like it.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Stop the talk.
I forgot. You're right. I wish all my physics courses were taught that way. Yeah, they prefer the traditional lecture. So I need to talk about this. This is really important, actually. So I hope you realize that it sort of conflicts with what I just told you, that I'm not aware of any student in my courses that would prefer traditional lectures. Okay. Yet, I always have what's called 1-minute papers at the end of each lecture. So there's a piece of paper students have to pick up in the back, and they know that at the end of each lecture, I give them 2 minutes. And on that piece of paper, I ask them, hey, were there some questions today that were not answered? Write them down. What did you find most interesting today? You know, something really quick. I call them 1-minute papers. You learn a lot from those. Okay. So some of the comments that I get sometimes when I teach an intro course where you're forced to cover a certain amount of content. And because you're forced to cover a certain amount of content, sometimes I'm like, I don't have time for you to go through the activities. So I'm going to have to lecture a bit faster. Okay. So no activities today. And then I lecture faster today. I will always have some students in the 1-minute papers that will write, I know I did not learn as much. Okay. But I sure liked the traditional lecture today because things were so clear. Right? It's a human emotion. It's normal. But the point is, what will happen to your students is the following. When you implement clickers, you're not going to get any pushback on that. None. But when you implement these types of active learning that are a bit more demanding, like these in-class activities where students are interrupted, they're asked to work hard and so forth, then you might have something like a third of the class, you know, maybe sometimes a half of the class at the beginning that will be resistant. They'll do the work. But if they're open to talk to you, they'll say, it's kind of hard. I'm confused all the time. I wish you would lecture more. Or when you do lecture more, I learn a lot more, right? But after they do the first exam, all this changes. And it's always the same. So a few of these students that are very vocal, they'll come to you and say, after the first exam, I couldn't believe it. I sat down to study for the exam and I realized how much I had learned already. It felt completely different than my other courses. And then everyone's on board. So if active learning is implemented properly, the worst that's going to happen is you're going to have some resistance from some students until the first midterm. But when you become a real pro at it, you can really, you know, nip that in the bud in week 1. Yeah, so that's why have an assessment early on so that students can see for themselves. But again, I hope I'm clear that if you do clickers, something like clickers, everyone's going to love it. Students going to be happy. There's no way one student will complain about that. Okay. Assuming the clicker question is good. And I always like to remind people, why is it that people just insist on traditional lecturing? When I say people, I mean instructors. Well, it's because there's a cognitive dissonance. Okay, because there's something I call about the illusion of teaching, just like the illusion of learning, right? So, as I said already, I think we've all had the experience of a superstar lecturer. We all feel like we've learned a lot from a lecturer. But the problem is much more pernicious than that, okay? Have you been in a colloquium or seminar before where you know in your heart that you actually learned something. For sure you learned something. Can you raise your hand if that's happened to you? Just let's participate. So wait, some of you don't raise their hands. That means you never learned something in a colloquium or seminar. So this is kind of important and it's fun to think about. So you can actually learn in a lecture. Of course you can learn. We all know that, right? So, but the type of active learning that I've been stressing here with those activities. Do you remember that the instructor does give a lecture after the activity? It is a lecture. And we showed you the evidence that students learn a lot from those mini lectures, right? But the reason why they learn a lot from that lecture is because the students' brain are primed for that lecture. Okay, so today, if you feel like, hey, there were a few moments when Louis was talking where I learned something very valuable. It wasn't just a fact. I was able to reorganize my knowledge. The reason why is because you're prepared for what I'm saying. You're not a complete novice for the information that's being given to you today. That's why. So that's why when we as experts, we go to seminars and colloquiums, you know, we can learn some things because we're prepared. But I go to colloquiums often that are not my field. And I promise you that after the 5th minute, I'm gone. I'm completely lost, right? Because all the information is foreign to me. It becomes all disorganized in my head. And now I look like one of my students in one of my intro courses. Okay, and the best that the colloquium speaker can achieve with me then is to give me a feeling of learning. And some colloquium speakers are really smooth and it works on me too sometimes. I get a strong feeling of learning. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so 2-stage exams. So clickers are bulletproof. 2-stage exams are bulletproof, and I was amazed to learn on Friday that some of you have actually done those already. I was shocked. So those have been around for a little over 10 years now, and it's amazing. I've never met an instructor who wasn't amazed, and students absolutely love them. So let me explain what they are. It's basically active learning on steroid, okay? So here's the logistics. So whenever you give a midterm exam, let's say it's typically 90 minutes, you collect the exams, you tell students go home, right? And then you grade them. The part of 2-stage exams here doesn't change. Students do their individual exam, they give you the individual exam after 90 minutes. But this time around though, it only counts for 80% of their overall midterm score. Because the other 20% is the group portion, where now instead of going home, they stay with you and they work as a group to redo the exam. And of course, it doesn't take 90 minutes. It takes a half hour, 45 minutes. And then they just basically work out, making sure essentially that they get the feedback on everything and that they practice their errors. Okay? So students love doing that. They absolutely love it. They can tell you, we feel that we learn a lot. And instructors are always floored when they see the intense engagement during the group exam. It's really intense. You might see an otherwise very shy student, that doesn't talk during class. The person is on his or her knees on the table trying to argue for something. And the reason why is that they just came out of this very high, intense, situation of the midterm exam. So trust me, they're as motivated and as engaged as you will ever see them during a group exam. So that's why it's active learning on steroid. Everyone's engaged. So, if a group, if for example, your individual exam score is 95%, but your group only scores 80%, you're not penalized. Your individual score replaces your group score. Anyway, so that's why students love it. And the point of the group exam is not to retest students, it's for them to learn from the experience. Okay, so here's the study that we did. And again, I don't care about the science education research aspect. It's what it teaches us. That's amazing. So here's what we did. So here's the individual exam. Okay, for that particular implementation, it was 75 minutes. And then followed by the group exam. Okay. And then later in the semester, 4 weeks later, a month later, we give them an exam that's very similar to the exam here, just to see how much they learn from the group exam. Okay? Because we have their individual score, then we have their boosted group exam score, and then we have that score here, so you can tell what happened. But we have another condition that we introduce, is instead of having students do the group exam as a group, we say, no. You guys don't get into groups, okay? Me, the instructor, I'm going to give you the feedback on the exam that you just did, right? You ask students, do you care? Would you like me to do that? Everyone raised their hands because, right, they just did the exam. So you do this for 45 minutes versus this for 45 minutes. And the question is, which ones are students going to like the most, are going to feel is the most productive? Those are affective questions. But a question that we really care about often is which one's going to be the most productive in terms of learning. Please don't say that's traditional lecturing. That's not. That's gold standard active learning. If you recall the worksheets in class, remember, students were asked to first work on the activity first so that they were prime for the mini lecture. Hence why they learned so much from the mini lecture. It's the same thing here, but it's on steroid, where now students work as hard as you'll ever see them work, okay? And then when they come for the instructor feedback, they'll listen and be engaged as much as you will ever see them be engaged. So again, gold standard active learning versus this. Which one wins? And I want to point out that during the instructor feedback, 100% of the time, students are getting a fluent explanation, not your neighbor who's trying to articulate their thoughts and you're trying to understand what they're saying, okay? And 100% of the time, the information is correct, okay? Whereas when they redo the exam as a group, I don't think we can expect all the information and all the arguments to be correct and very clear. So, it gets better. When you survey students, you ask them, hey, approximately how much of the time during the group exam do you spend discussing errors, things that you would think are not as productive as hearing the correct reasoning from the instructor, right? How much time do you spend discussing errors? How much time, are people just articulating incorrect thinking? And it's not like a student says 5% of the time, 95% of the time. It's about a half. It's about 40% average. And when you, as the instructor, walk around and listen to the groups, you can tell that makes sense. Because oftentimes you listen and you're like, what they're saying is wrong. Like they're still struggling with the physics of this and that, right? They're not there yet. So is that more productive than the instructor just spending the entire time on this? Well, it turns out it is. Because this is the results here. I should have guided you with some arrows here. The results essentially are that, the results, these bars here, this is the group who ended up doing the group exam. And this is the group who ended up getting the instructor feedback. And you see they scored the same on the individual exam. Of course, the same average, right? Because they're large groups. However, 1 month later, this is the score of the students on a similar exam. But those students got the feedback in the form of a group. And 40% of their time was incorrect thinking. They got a higher score than these students here who got the correct thinking feedback from the instructor. Isn't that interesting? Right? So there's something very powerful. And you have to ask the question, this is weird. Again, this is gold standard active learning. So that means traditional lecturing would have been even worse. So there's some magic about students working together. And I must tell you, I did not start doing science education myself. I was an atomic physicist. I knew nothing about science education until after my postdoc, right? So for me, when I remember when I would struggle with this notion of collaborative learning when students work in group, because I could see it with my eyes that it seems inefficient. Right? It doesn't seem to be very quick. Like the information density is very low. That bothered me. But let's talk about why this is so effective And to do that, we have to go back to the 4 elements of deliberate practice. And I think you'll see it right away. But before I do so, these are the survey results. When it came to which one did you enjoy the most? The feedback from the instructor or during the group exam was about the same. The perceived learning was about the same. Everything was about the same. Okay? But the actual learning was different. So why does this study matter? Well, because in the instructor feedback, there's no error engagement. Let me flip the page. Do you remember element number 3? I said this one is often neglected. It's a neglected child, right? There was none of that in the instructor. Because the whole time, think about free throw in basketball, okay? And somehow the athlete is struggling with the elbow position, right? And the coach's job is to teach the athlete how to throw correctly, having the elbow like this and not like that. So what the coach must do or must not do is to tell the athlete, here's the error you're making, now throw like this. That would just be feedback on what's correct. It would not be an error engagement. So for the neural network to be rewired, really, because it feels so natural to, what is it called, proning your elbow or something? It feels so natural to do this, that invariably, if this neural network is still active during a game, the person will still do this. So it's very important that you rewire the brain, and to do that, you have to engage with the actual error. So the coach has to say, do your error, the incorrect thinking, if you will, and try to throw, and then do this like this and try to throw. See which one is best, right? So that's how you can prune the, and that's the technical term, by the way, in neuroscience. So, yeah, so that's what they're doing during the group exam. So instructor feedback, no error engagement. You're just basically telling them, this is correct, please do that. Whereas, of course, there's explicit error engagement. So that's something that we have to do somehow, but it's not easy to do. And I would say it's not for durable learning. It's for reorganizing knowledge whenever that's required. If someone does an algebraic error, do you think they need to reorganize their knowledge? If they do a simple algebraic error in front of you and you're the teacher, no big reorganization is required. Therefore, an error engagement is not necessary. You can just give the feedback, which is element 2, if you recall. You say, hey, that was wrong, a factor of 2, right? But whenever there's any element of having to reorganize something, you must have the practice, the student practice the error. So it's very difficult for the instructor to actually do something, him or herself, to help students with error engagement. The only way I know how to do it is for students to interact with each other. I don't know how the instructor can do that. Okay, so a few words about AI tutors. I think you guys are excited about the AI in education, right? So raise your hand if you think more than 75% of your students are using AI in your courses or in courses. Okay, again, I'm not here, I don't know, but I can tell you what's going on in North America. It's almost 100%. Not 100, but almost 100. So it's something you just have to deal with. There's no way you can say, don't use AI to students. It's the new Google, right? Like it or not. Now, let me get you interested into something here. So, are we going to have AI tutors or not? That's the question. First, do you think we have one right now? An AI tutor, or not quite yet? Yeah, we don't. Do you feel like there was some sort of promise 2-3 years ago of an AI tutor? Sure. Yeah, okay. So this guy here is Sal Khan, Khan Academy? I have a lot of respect for the values provided around the world. But yeah, he would go around say, oh, it's going to be like everyone having a pocket calculator, in a few years from now. And for at least someone like me who had already been doing research using AI in education, I was like, whoa, this is not true. In fact, I don't know if it'll ever happen. Now look at a skeptic. A skeptic, this person here is one of the central AI person in education at IBM. Look, it's kind of funny. It says, delivering on becoming a generalized personal tutor. It won't be for decades, or at least if ever. At the bottom, we'll have flying cars before we'll have AI tutors, right? So this is going to be like a pocket calculator in a few years, and we'll have flying cars before. So what gives? You know, what's going to happen? Well, I like to tell people that it's sort of an in-between. Okay, what the person means here is that using those large language models or different kinds of AIs where we vacuum up all the information and we manipulate all the information that's in the world, we're going to be able to design tutors. I agree with that person. No, we cannot and we never will. But it turns out there's something else that we can do to actually get close to a really good AI tutor. And that's what I want to convey to you right now. I know we're pretty much out of time, so if I spend one more minute, yeah. So, okay, the fundamental limitations of LLMs is this. Look, they lack the intrinsic understanding of student cognitive processes. They lack the nuances, you know, that you gain as a teacher after you've taught something for a while. You know that the value is pretty much all in these things. It's unable to access data on common student questions, their common difficulties and misconceptions. Which one of us, after we teach a course, says, whoa, I've learned a lot about the common difficulties, the misconceptions, and so forth. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to put that on the internet. Right? That's why this knowledge, which is most precious, and we as experienced teachers, we use when we help our students, is nowhere to be found on the internet. There's some of it, but it's a drop in an ocean, you know, for what's on the internet. So therefore, the LLMs don't have the training material that's needed, okay? And of course, they cannot adapt. They don't know if you are talking to the LLM and you happen to be an expert physicist or chemist or biologist, or if you're an intro student struggling, right? So there's no adaptation. However, there is a solution. The solution is that if we find a way somehow to extract from your brain the precious information that you acquire after teaching students for a while, if we can extract that information and digitalize that, then now all of a sudden this AI has the information as training material. So the big thing is, how do we extract that information? That's the big problem. And that's what I've been working on. Now, if I may say, people find the following useful. The way those LLMs feel for students right now, or for anyone for that matter, is the following. And that's when they're operating at their best, okay? Is as though a student came into your office, they asked you a question, and then you decided to play the role of an AI. And if you do that, what you do is, I heard the question, you don't speak. You're a computer, you open up the right textbook, open it up, you got the right page, and you got the right paragraph here, and you tell the student, your question is being answered here. And your answer is going to be a textbook-like answer. So that's actually almost miraculous. That's amazing, and that's why students use AI already. They find that useful. But as you know, would students keep coming to your office? Would they find that really useful if the only way you help them is to do that? They wouldn't. That's why when we survey students now, do you use AI as a tutor? They'll tell you no. They use AI as like a Google, like a fancy Google search, and as an answer checker or solution checker. So I started actually in 2017, a platform. So we've developed this that's based on this notion of extracting information from someone like me and to put that into these knowledge graphs and so forth so that the AI feels more human. But it's really hard to do and it's really expensive. So that's why governments would have to get involved doing that. I'm not going to show you anything else. I'm just going to tell you there are some applications of AI that are already there that are amazing, okay? But they must make use of the superpowers of those LLMs. one superpower of LLM is semantic understanding of words, right? So the way I used it, and it's now being used in many courses at Harvard, is when you have a class of 300 students, the majority of students cannot ask a question. They feel too shy, there's no time for it, and so forth, right? So what you do is every half hour or something like this, you stop everything and you say, everyone gets to ask a question now. Okay, so go on the platform, they all ask a question or two, and then you feed that to the AI, and you ask the AI to organize all those questions into themes and to produce representative questions for each theme. And I'll just show you like a result in one of my course. Students love that. See, I had about 100 students, and they submitted 1 or 2 questions each, and the AI arranged those within seconds, into 3 themes, and then representative questions for each theme. And then I have students look at those. And then I tell them, hey, I'll answer those questions tonight, and they'll be posted on Modal, I think, that you use, or Canvas. Students absolutely love that. And of course, we had to do a study to see if the AI did a good job. And to see if the AI did a good job, we had to test ourselves to say, I'm going to come up with a thematic summary myself. For 100 students, I'm not exaggerating, it takes about 3 hours. You have to keep rearranging questions, and it takes a long time. And finally, you come up with a really good thematic summary. And then you have to compare it with what AI does. And because this uses one of the LLM superpower, it shouldn't surprise you that this is extraordinarily accurate. So students do find that really, really useful. So that's an example of LLMs right now that really brings value. But as far as an AI tutor, it's going to take some time. Okay, I think it's a good place to stop.
So we have time for some questions, right?
Sure.
Questions? Oh,
Thinking about teaching assessment on active learning, how can we promote, or what has been your experience regarding instructor peer feedback? So here we have been talking about learners, and how can we get feedback from them, and how are we going to apply active learning with students? But teachers are also learners.
Yeah.
And they are not prepared for this kind of classes. So how can we keep the motivation up and also assess whether they are really applying active learning or they are just mixing different concepts?
Yeah, of course, then you need experts, right? So it starts with one expert here that can then train 2, they can then train others. That's the only way it's going to work. There are things that I've been trying to formalize that a little bit, like the COPUS. These are observation protocols where you have a trained observer that comes in the classroom, and every 2 minutes they look at what's happening, and then they have a, like a, I don't know what it's called, but anyway, a note sheet of describing what they think is happening, and then you call this active learning versus no active learning. But that doesn't tell you if the active learning is being implemented well. For that, you need a human expert to come in. Like I could come into your course and I could give you feedback on that, right?
Right.
So
Because I was also considering that it's not the same to have doing feedback than actually having different peers talking about how have they been applying it. So
oh no, that would be quite useful for sure. I've been through in this business for a while now. You have group meetings, right? Every week, every 2 weeks, like a core group, and then you discuss some of the problems you're experiencing, questions that you have. And I'm assuming through talks like this one, the workshops that you've had and so forth. No. You can do a lot of the heavy lifting doing that. But ultimately, you need experts to come in, and you need to have one person here that becomes the expert or 2. But honestly, I was in Norway and in Britain just last month or something, and it's really disheartening to see, the lack of openness over there. But it's not surprising, I know that already, to active learning. Even when you see results like this, it's become insane to be insensitive to that. So coming here, I must tell you, seeing the enthusiasm that I'm seeing, I'm going to be watching this very closely. And I think it should work if you guys are that motivated to make it work, which will be kind of a beacon, I must say, in Latin America. Anything else?
More questions? Déjame que te paso el micrófono. Es para la transmisión en YouTube.
In many of the activities you presented, there is some sort of anonymity from the students involved in whatever they're doing. So I was wondering, what is your assessment about the role of anonymity in all these engagements and that?
Actually, interestingly, in everything that I've showed today, there was no anonymity. Their names are on everything. Yeah. So, yeah, that's. I mean, are you talking about surveys maybe, or even like the activities themselves, or?
Basically everything from the clickers all the way to the group activities.
Yeah, the clickers. It's important that there needs to be. They need to answer to something, right? There needs to be an incentive, a great incentive, and to have that, there has to be their name associated with their answer. But for the in-class activities, they don't have to hand that in. They can just throw them in the trash when they come out of the classroom. But again, if things are built properly, is that if they don't do the in-class activities, they don't pay attention, they know real quick that they're not going to learn much from it. And these mini quiz, they're like clickers, right? That are going to come, that count for something, they're going to do poorly on those. So there are ways to mitigate that, but no, anonymity is only for surveys.
One short question with one short answer. For your physics department, are using all your professors the active learning?
For what, I'm sorry? Oh, our physics department.
Yes.
No, but I would say 50% of our courses have some active learning in them. I would say that's fair to say, at least 50%. That's a lot. I think it should be 100%. But that's at least 50%.
More questions?
Thank you, Louis. I was at the Casa Galvan on Saturday, so I would like to ask you about these 1 minute videos. I mean, when you were asked about the minimum, how to say the minimum instruments to implement some active learning, you mentioned these 1 minute videos. So can you reflect something about that?
Sure. So what I was describing in the workshop is that something as silly and simple sounding as producing 60 1-minute, 2-minute videos for each concept at the end of each week and giving students access to those. It sounds pretty simple. And like I said, how many activities do you have per lecture? Between 4 and 7. So that means at the end of a week, you'd have maybe 15 such videos. So it would take students about 20 minutes to go through them. Sometimes they'll replay a video twice or something like that. And each video only focuses on clarifying that particular concept or idea. And what I was explaining in the workshop is that if students watch those videos at the right time in their learning, it has a disproportional impact. And I was telling everyone that this is only 20 minutes, but because it's a 20-minute at the right time, it's the most impact per unit time I've ever seen in education. And what time is this? It's right after lecture. Because right after lecture, all the ideas that were presented, the concepts, they're not organized in your mind just yet. All you have as a student is a bunch of ideas that are kind of floating around. And in fact, if you ask students to go on a piece of paper and to write down those ideas and to start putting connections, do you see that 2 ideas are connected? They'd be struggling. They'd be like, I guess so. the best that they have is a table of content. They just don't see how things are connected. And it turns out that you cannot move past that and start learning more. Okay, you're stuck. So what happens to all novice learners is that they start doing homework and they fumble around. Okay, and it's really frustrating. But through fumbling around, those who persist, then you start seeing the connections. And by the time you're almost at the end of your homework, the connections are pretty clear. So you no longer need those 1 minute videos when the connections are clear. But in the middle there, it was quite inefficient. So if someone came and provided you that tool of 1 minute videos at that right time, you say, hey, everything's disorganized after a lecture, right? Yes. Okay, here's the 1 minute videos, 20 minutes. It makes a huge impact. Does that answer? Yeah.
More questions?
Have you seen an evolution in the feeling of learning through different applications of this activities, of this active learning?
Yes.
Through courses?
Yes.
And is it related to the feeling of becoming an expert?
You mean as a student progresses through a program?
Yes.
Yes, if they learn through active learning, absolutely. In fact, if a student has had a good active learning course, they'll complain to the program when they then go to a course that doesn't use active learning. So the culture has really changed now. If the active learning was implemented well, that is. Yeah. So again, the notion in North America to not use some form of active learning is a no-go now. It's a no-go. And I always like to tell people, I'll say it real quick, it's part of my sales pitch. I always tell them, think about how insane we are, and I count myself as part of this because I was thinking the same thing when I started to do science education. I was a staunch traditional lecturer, and I was somewhat good at it, okay? How crazy this is that imagine having a lecture hall filled with 200 students, and you do a lecture, and it feels like something productive happened, right? But then contrast that to asking 199 out of 200 students to go home, and you keep that one student there, and then you behave the same. You say, you're only going to get to ask maybe 1 or 2 questions the whole lecture, and you listen to me nonstop for 90 minutes. Even you would think you're insane. You would think that's completely unproductive because you keep watching the student as you're talking, but you're not allowed to adapt to that one student because you're supposed to do the same as with the 200. You could tell, oh my God, he's lost, you know? You have to keep going, right? It feels insane. So people, I gotta say, the culture in North America has caught on to that. But it requires effort to change. So some people, you know, they're busy with their research. They don't have the mentoring to change. And they've heard that if you do the change without some mentoring, it could be dangerous. So that accounts for the other 50% that are not doing it, I would say.
Okay. Maybe just one more question because Louis has a plane to catch. No? So, okay. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you for everything.